We want to get the carbon data in front of the right people so they can put climate impact as part of the decision-making process. Because ultimately, data in and of itself is a catalyst for change.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, where we explore the developing world of sustainable software development. We kicked off this podcast more than 2 years ago with a discussion about cloud carbon calculators and the open source tool, Cloud Carbon Footprint, and Amazon's Cloud Carbon calculator. And since then, the term GreenOps has become a term of art in cloud computing circles when we talk about reducing the environmental impacts of cloud computing. But what is GreenOps in the first place? With me today is James Hall, the head of GreenOps at Greenpixie, the cloud computing startup, cloud carbon computing startup, to help me shed some light on what this term actually means and what it's like to use GreenOps in the trenches. James, we have spoken about this episode as a bit of an intro, and I'm wondering if I can ask you a little bit about where this term came from in the first place and how you ended up as the de facto head of GreenOps in your current gig, because I've never spoken to a head of GreenOps before. So yeah, maybe I should ask you that.
Yeah, well, I've been with Greenpixie right from the start, and we weren't really using the term GreenOps when we originally started. It was cloud sustainability. It was about, changing regions to optimize cloud and right sizing. We didn't know about the FinOps industry either when we first started. We just knew there was a cloud waste problem and we wanted to do something about it. Luckily, when it comes to cloud, there is a big overlap between what saves costs and what saves carbon. But I think the term GreenOps has existed before we started in the industry. I think it actually originally, if you go to Wikipedia, GreenOps is actually to do with arthropods and trilobites from a couple million years ago, funnily enough. But I'm not sure when it started becoming, green operations. But it originally had a connotation of like data centers and IT and devices. And I think cloud GreenOps, where Greenpixie specializes, is more of a recent thing, because it used to be about it is about how do you get the right data in front of the right people so they can start making better decisions ultimately, and that's kind of what GreenOps means to me. So Greenpixie are a GreenOps data company. We're not here to make decisions for you. We're not a consultancy. We want to get the carbon data in front of the right people so they can put climate impact as part of the decision-making process. Because ultimately, data in and of itself is a catalyst for change. Whether you use this data to reduce carbon or you choose to ignore it, that's up to the organization. But it's all about being more informed ignoring or changing your strategy around the carbon data.
Cool. Thank you for that, James. You mentioning Wikipedia and GreenOps being all about trilobites and arthropods makes me realize we definitely should add that to the show notes. And that's the thing I'll quickly just do, because I forgot to just do the usual intro, folks. My name's Chris Adams. I'm one of the technology and policy director at the Green Web Foundation, and I'm also the chair of the policy working group inside the Green Software Foundation. All the things that James and I will be talking about, we'll do our best to judiciously add show notes so you too can look up the origins of, the etymology of GreenOps and find out all about arthropods and trilobites and probably a lot more cloud computing as well, actually. Okay, thank you for that, James. So you spoke a little, and you did a really nice job of actually introducing what Greenpixie does, because that was something I should have asked you earlier as well. So I have some experience using these tools like Cloud Carbon Footprint and so on to estimate the environmental impact of digital services, right? And a lot of the time, these things use billing data. So there are tools out there that do already do this stuff. But one thing that I saw that sets Greenpixie apart from some other tools as well was this certification process. The fact that you folks have, I think, an ISO 14064 certification. Now, not all of us read over ISO standards for fun. So can you maybe explain why that matters and what that changes at all, or even what that certification means? Because it sounds kind of impressive and exciting, but I'm not quite sure. And I know there are other standards floating around, like the software carbon intensity standard, for example. Like, yeah, maybe you could just provide an intro, then see how that might be different, for example.
Yeah, so ISO 14064 is a kind of set of standards and instructions on how to calculate a carbon number, essentially, based on the greenhouse gas protocol. So the process of getting that verification is, you have official auditors who are certified to give out these certifications. And ultimately, they go through all your processes, all your sources, all the inputs of your data, and kind of verify that the outputs and the inputs make sense. Do they align with what the greenhouse gas protocol tells you to do? And it's a year-long process as they get to know absolutely everything about your business and processes. You really got to show them under the hood. But from a customer perspective, it means that it proves that the methodology you're using is very rigorous, and it gives them confidence that they can use yours. I think if a company that produces carbon data has an ISO badge, then you can probably be sure that when you put this data in your ESG reports or use it to make decisions, the auditors will also agree with it. Because the auditors on the other side, your assurers or from EY and PwC, they'll be using the same set of guidance, basically. So it's kind of like getting ahead of the auditing process. In the same way, like a security ISO would mean that that the chief security officer that would need to check a new vendor that they're about to procure from. If you've got the ISO already, they meet our standards for security. It saves me a job having to go and look through every single data processing agreement that they have.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's a few different ways that you can kind of establish trust. And so one of the options is have everything entirely open, like say cloud carbon footprint, or open cost has a bunch of stuff in the open. There's also various other approaches, like we maintain a library called CO2GS, so we try to share our methodologies there. And then one of the other options is certification. That's another source of trust. I've got to ask, is this common? Are there other tools that have this? Because when I think about some of the big cloud calculators, do you know if they have this? Let's say I'm using, say, one of the big three cloud providers. Do these have, like today, do you know if they actually have the same certification? Or is that a thing I should be looking for if I don't, or I should be asking about if I'm relying on the numbers that I'm seeing from our providers like this?
Yeah, they actually don't. Well, technically, Azure's tool did get one in 2020, but you need to get them renewed and re-audited as part of the process. So that one's kind of become invalid. And I'm not sure AWS or Google Cloud have actually tried, to be honest. But it's quite a funny thought that, arguably because of this ISO, the data we give you on GCP and AWS is more accurate than the data, or at least more reliable than the data that comes directly out of the cloud providers.
Okay, all right. Let's make sure we don't get sued. So I'm just going to stop there before we go any further. But that's like one of the things that it provides. Essentially, it's an external auditor who's looked through this stuff. So rather than being entirely open, that's one of the other mechanisms that you have. Okay, cool. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about open source, because I actually first found out about Greenpixie a few years ago when the Green Software Foundation sent me to Egypt for COP27 to try and talk to people about green software. And I won't lie, I mostly got blank looks from most people. There are people tend to talk about sustainability of tech or sustainability via tech, and people tend not to see them as. Most of the time, I see people like conflating the two rather than actually realizing, no, we're talking about of the technology, not just how it's good for stuff, for example. And he told me, I think one of your colleagues, Rory, was this? He was telling me a bit about that Greenpixie was initially using when you just first started out. You started looking at some tools like Cloud Carbon Footprint as maybe a starting point, but you've ended up having to make various changes to overcome various technical challenges when you scale the use up to like a large basically on larger clients and things like that. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the challenges you ended up facing when you're trying to implement GreenOps like this? Because it's not something that I have direct experience myself. And it's also a thing that I think a lot of people do reach for some open source tools, and they're not quite sure why you might use one over the other, or what kind of problems they have to deal with when you start processing those levels of like billing and usage data and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think with cloud sustainability methodologies, the two main issues are things like performance and the data volume, and then also the maintenance of it. Because just the very nature of cloud is, huge data sets that change rapidly, they get updated on the hour. And then you've also got the cloud providers always releasing new services, new instance types, things like that. So, I mean, like your average enterprises with like 100 million spend or something, those line items of usage data, if you like go down to the hour, will be billions of rows and terabytes of data. And that is not trivial to process. A lot of the tooling at the moment, including Cloud Carbon Footprint, will try to, use a bunch of SQL queries to truncate it, make it go up to monthly. So you kind of take out the rows by, a factor of 24 times 30 or whatever that is.
It's about 740 normally, I think, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Then they'll remove things like, there's certain fields in the usage data that will that are so unique that when you start removing those and truncating it, you're really reducing the size of the files, but you're really losing a lot of that granularity, because ultimately this billing data is to be used by engineers and finance people. They use all these fields. So when you start removing fields because you can't handle the data, you're losing a lot of the familiarity of the data and a lot of the usability for the people who need to use it to make decisions. So one of the big challenges is, how do you make a processor that can easily handle billions of line items without, falling over? And CCF, one of the issues was the performance, really, when you start trying to apply it to big data sets. And then on the other side is the maintenance. Arguably, it's probably not that difficult to make a methodology of a point in time, but over the 6 months it takes you to create it, it's way out of date. They've released 100 new instance types across the 3 providers. There's a new type of storage. There's a brand new services. There's new AI models out there. And so now, like, Greenpixie's main job is, how do we make sure the data is we have more coverage of all the SKUs that come out, and we can deliver the data faster, and customers have more choices of how to ingest it. So if you give customers enough choice and you give it to them quick enough, and it's, covering all of their services, then, that's lack of those 3 things is really what's stopping people from doing GreenOps, I think.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned was just the volume, the fact that you've got, hours multiply the number of different, like 1,000 different computers or thousands of computers. That's a lot of data. And then there's like one of the issues about like the metrics issue. Like if you want to provide a simple metric, then you end up losing a lot of data. So that's one of the things you spoke about. And the other one was just the idea of models themselves not being there. There's an actual cost associated with having to maintain these models. And as far as I'm aware, there aren't. I mean, are there any kind of open sources of models so that you can say, well, this is what the figures probably would be for an Amazon EC, 6XL instance, for example? That's the stuff you're talking to when you say the models that they're hard to keep up to date, and you have to do that internally inside the organization. Is that it?
Yeah, so we've got a team dedicated to doing that, but ultimately, like, there will always be assumptions in there, because some of these chipsets you actually can't even get your hands on. So, if Amazon release a new instance type that uses an Intel Xeon 785C, that is not commercially available. So how do you get your hands on an Intel Xeon 785B that is commercially available? And you're like, okay, these 6 things are similar in terms of performance and hardware. So we're using this as the proxy for the M5 large or whatever it is. And then once you've got the power consumption of those instance types, then you can start saying, okay, this is how we're mapping instances to real life hardware. And then that's when you got to start being really transparent about the assumptions, because ultimately there's no right answer. All you can do is tell people, this is how we do it. Do you like it? Do you not? And, over the 4 years we've been doing this, there's been a lot of trial and error. I actually, right at the start, one of the questions was, what are my credentials? How did I end up as head of GreenOps? I wouldn't have said 4 years ago I have any credentials to be, a head of GreenOps. There was a while when I was the only head of GreenOps in the world, according to Sales Navigator. Why me? But I think it's like, they say if you do 10,000 hours of anything, you become good at it. And I wouldn't say I'm a master by any means, but I've made more mistakes and probably tried more things than anybody else over the 4 years. So, just from the war stories, I've seen what works, I've seen what doesn't work. And I think that's the kind of experience people want to trust, and why Greenpixie made me the head of GreenOps.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that, James. So maybe this is actually a nice segue to talk about a common starting point that lots of people do actually have. So over the last few years, we've also seen people talk about moved away, not just talking about DevOps, but talking about like FinOps, this idea that you might apply kind of some financial thinking to how you purchase and consume, say, cloud services, for example. And this tends to, as far as I understand, kind of nudge people towards things like serverless or certain kinds of ways of buying it in a way which is almost, very much influenced by I guess, the financial sector. And you said before that there's some overlap, but it's not totally over there. It's not. You can't just basically take a bunch of FinOps practices, think it's going to actually help here. Can we explore that a bit and maybe talk a little bit about what folks get wrong when they try to like map this straight across as if it's the same thing, please?
Yeah. So one of the big issues is cost proxies, actually. A lot of FinOps is as well, how do you fix or how do you optimize from a cost perspective what already exists? You've already emitted it. How do you now make it cheaper? The first low-hanging fruit that a finance guy trying to reduce their cloud spend would do is things like, buy the instances up front. So you've paid for the full year, and now you've been given 1 million hours of compute. Mm-hmm. That might cut your bill in half, but if anything, that would drive your usage up. You've got 1 million hours, you're going to use them.
So you have to commit to then spending 1 million. You're like, oh, great, I halved the cost, but now I definitely need to use these, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you say commitments, like I promise AWS I'm going to spend $2 million. So I'm going to do whatever it takes to spend that $2 million. If I don't spend $2 million, I'll actually have to pay the difference. So if I only do 1 million in compute, I'm going to have to pay 1 million and get nothing for it. So I'm going to do as much compute as humanly possible to get the most bang for my buck. And I think that's where a lot of the issues is with using cost. Like if you tell someone something's cheap, they're not going to use less. They're going to be like, this looks like a great deal. I'm guilty of it myself. I'll buy clothes I don't need because it's on a clearance sale, and that's kind of how cloud operates. But when you start when you get a good methodology that really looks at the usage and the nuances between chipsets and storage tiers, there is a big overlap between, cutting the cost from a 2x large to a large. That may halve your bill, and it will halve your carbon. And that's the kind of things you need to be looking out for. You need a really nuanced methodology that really looks at the usage more than just trying to use costs.
Okay, so that's one place where it's not so helpful. And you said a little bit like there are some places where it does help, like literally just halving the size of the machine is one of the things you might actually do. Now, I've got to ask, you spoke before about like region shifting and stuff, something you mentioned before. Is there any incentive to do anything like that when you are looking at buying stuff in this way? Or is there any kind of, what's the word I'm after, opinion that FinOps or GreenOps has around things like that? Because as far as I can tell, there is very rarely a financial incentive to do anything like that. If anything, it usually costs more to use, maybe say, run something in, say, Switzerland, for example, compared to running in AWS East, for example. I mean, is that something you've seen any signs of there where people kind of nudge people towards the greener choice rather than just showing like a green logo on a dashboard, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where GreenOps comes into its own, really, because I could tell everyone to move to France or Switzerland, but when you come to each individual cloud environment, they will have policies and approved regions and data sovereignty things. And this is why all you can do is give them the data and then let the enterprise make the decision. But ultimately, like, we're working with a retailer who had a failover for storage and compute, but they had it all failing over to one of the really dirty regions. Like, I think they were based in the UK and they failed over to Germany, but they did have Sweden as one of the options for failover, and they just weren't using it. There's no particular reason they weren't using it, but they had just chosen Germany at one point. So why not just make that failover option Sweden? You know, if it's within the limits of your policies and what you're allowed to do. But yeah, region switching isn't completely trivial, unfortunately, in the cloud. So, you know, you wouldn't lift and shift your entire environment to another place because there are performance, there are cost implications. But again, it's like, how do you add sustainability impact to the trade-off decision? You know, if increasing your cost 10% is worth a 90% carbon reduction for you, great, please do it if, you know, the hours of work are worth it for you. But if cost is the priority, where is the middle ground where you can be like, okay, these two regions are the same, they have the same latency, but this one's 20% less carbon. That is the reason I'm going to move over there. So it's all about, you can do the cost benefit analysis quite easily, and many people do. How do you enable them to do a carbon benefit analysis as well? And then once they've got all the data in front of them, just start making more informed decisions. And that's why I think the data is more important than, you know, necessarily telling them what the processes are, giving them here's the ultimate guide to GreenOps. You know, data is just a catalyst for decisions. And if you just need to give them trustworthy data, and then how many use cases does trustworthy data have? You know, how long is a piece of string? I've seen many, but every time there's a new customer, there's new use cases.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So one thing that we spoke before in this kind of pre-call was the fact that sustainability is becoming somewhat more mainstream, and there's now within the kind of FinOps foundation, or the people who are doing stuff for FinOps, so they're starting to kind of wake up to this and trying to figure out how to incorporate some of this into the way they might kind of operate a team or a cloud or anything like that. And I believe you told me about a thing called Focus, which is, this is like something like a standardization project across all of FinOps. And now there's a sustainability working group, particularly inside this focus group. For people who are not familiar with this, could you tell me what Focus is and what this sustainability working group is working on? You know, because working groups are supposed to work on stuff, right?
Yeah. So exactly as you said, Focus is a standardization of billing data. So, you know, when you get your AWS bill, your Azure bill, they have similar data in them, but they will be completely different column names, completely different granularities, different column sizes. And so if you're trying to make a master report where you can look at all of your cloud and all of your SaaS bills, you need to do all sorts of data transformations to try and make the columns look the same. You know, maybe AWS has a column that goes one step more granular than Azure, or you're trying to, you know, do a bill on all your compute, but Azure calls it virtual machines, AWS calls it EC2. So you either need to go and categorize them all yourself to make a master category that lets you group by all these different things, or, you know, thankfully Focus have gone and done that themselves. And it started off as a Python script you could run on your own data set to do the transformation for you. But slowly more cloud providers are adopting the Focus framework, which means, you know, when you're exporting your billing data, you can ask AWS, give me the original or give me a Focus one. And so they start giving you the data in a way where it's like, I can easily combine all my data sets. And the reason this is super interesting for Carbon is because, you know, Carbon is a currency in many ways, in the fact that
there's a price on it in Europe. There's a price on it in the UK.
There's a price on it. But also, like, the way Azure will present you their carbon data could be, you know, the equivalent of yen. AWS could be the equivalent of dollars. they're all saying CO2e, so you might think they're equivalent, but actually they're almost completely different currencies. So this effort of standardization is, how do we bring it back? Maybe like, don't give us the CO2e, but how do we go a few steps before that point? And like, how do we start getting similar numbers? So when we want to make a master report for all the cloud providers, it's apples to apples, not apples to oranges. You know, how do we standardize the data sets to make the reporting, the cross-cloud reporting, more meaningful for FinOps people?
Ah, I see. Okay. So I didn't realize that the focus stuff has actually listing, I guess, like what let's call them primitives, like, you know, compute and storage. Like they all have different names for that stuff, but focus has a kind of shared idea for what the concept of cloud compute, a virtual machine might be, and likewise for storage. So that's the thing you're trying to attach a carbon value to in these cases, so you can make some meaningful judgment, or so you can present that information to people, right?
Yeah, it's about making the reports look the same, but also how do you make the numbers, the source of the numbers, more similar? Because currently Azure may say 100 tons in their dashboard, AWS may say 1 ton in their dashboard. You know, the spend and the real carbon could be identical, but it's just the formula behind it is so vastly different that you're coming out with 2 different numbers.
Ah, I see. I think you're referring to, at this point here, some places they might share a number which is what we refer to as a location-based figure. So that's like what is kind of considered on the ground based on like the power intensity from the grid in like a particular part of the world. And then a market-based figure might be quite a bit lower because you said, well, we've purchased all this green energy, so therefore we're going to kind of deduct that from what a figure should be. And that's how we'd have a figure of like 1 versus 100. But if you're not comparing these two together, these are going to look totally different. And like you said, it's not apples with apples. It's apples with very, 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 yeah, it's something totally different. Okay. That is helpful.
It gets a lot more confusing than that, because it's not just market and location based. Like you could have 2 location based numbers, but Azure are using the grid carbon intensity annual average from 2020 because that's what they've got approved. AWS may be using, you know, our world in data 2023 number. You know, and those are just 2 different sources for grid intensity. And then what categories are they including? Are they including scope 3 categories? Mm-hmm. How many of the scope 3 categories are they including? So when you've got like 100 different inputs that go into a CO2 number, unless all 100 are the same, you do not have a meaningful comparison between the 2. Even location and market base is just one aspect of what goes into the CO2 number. And then where do they get the kilowatt hour numbers from? Is it a literal telemetry device, or are they using a spend-based proxy on their side? Because that's not completely alien to cloud providers to ultimately rely on spend at the end of the day. So does Azure use spend, or does AWS use spend? What type of spend are they using? And that's where you need the transparency as well. Because if you don't understand where the numbers come from, it could be the most accurate number in the world. But if they don't tell you everything that went into it, how are you meant to know?
Ah, I see. Okay, that's really, really interesting, because the Green Web Foundation, the organization I'm part of, there's a UK government group called the Government Digital Sustainability Alliance. And they've been doing these really fascinating lunch and learns. And one thing that showed up was when the UK government was basically saying, look, this is the carbon footprint, you know, on a kind of per department level. Like this is what the Ministry of Justice is, or this is what, say, the Ministry of Defense might be, for example. And that helps explain why you had figures where you had a bunch of people saying the carbon footprint of all these data centers is really, 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 really high. And then you said people were talking about saying, well, we're comparing this to cloud. Cloud looks great, but because the figures for cloud are way, way, way lower. But the thing that people had to caveat that with, they basically said, well, we know that this makes cloud look way, way, way more efficient here, and it looks like it's much, much, much lower carbon. But because we've only got this final kind of market-based figure, we know that it's not a like-for-like comparison. But until we have that information, this is the best we actually have. And this is an organization which actually has like legally binding targets. They have to reduce emissions by a certain figure by a certain date. This does seem like it has to be. I can see why you would need this transparency, because it seems very, very difficult to see how you could meaningfully track your progress towards a target if you don't have access to that, right?
Yeah. Well, I always like to use the currency conversion analogy, but if you had a dashboard where AWS is all in dollars, Azure or your on-premise is in yen, there's 149 yen in $1. So, but if you didn't know this one's yen and this one's dollars, you'd be like, this one's 149 times cheaper. Why aren't we going all in, all in on this one? But actually, there's just different currencies, and they are the same at the end of the day under the hood. They're the same, but just the way they've turned it into an accounting exercise has kind of muddied the water, which is why I love electricity metrics more. They're almost like the non-fungible token of data centers and cloud, because you can use that to calculate location base. You can use it to calculate market base. You can use electricity to calculate water cooling and metrics and things like that. So if you can get the electricity, then you're well on your way to meaningful comparisons.
And that's the one that everyone guards very, very jealously a lot of the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's directly related to your cost of running business, and that is the proprietary information, unfortunately.
I see. Okay. All right. So we've done a bit of a deep dive into the GSG protocol, Scope 3 supply chain emissions and things like that. If I may, you mentioned, you referenced this idea of war stories before, right? And it's surprisingly hard to find people with real world stories about, making meaningful changes to like cloud emissions in the world. Do you have any like stories that you've come across in the last 4 years that you think are particularly worth sharing, or that might be worth, catch people's attention, for example? Like there's got to be something that you found that you're allowed to talk about, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, MasterCard are one of our lighthouse customers. They've spoken about the work we're doing with them a lot in various FinOps conferences and things like that. But they're very advanced in their GreenOps goals. They have quite ambitious net zero goals, and they take their IT sustainability very seriously. Well, when we first spoke to them, ultimately the name of the game was to get the cloud measurement up to the point of their on-premise, because their on-premise was very advanced. Daily electricity metrics with pre-approved CO2 numbers, or CO2 carbon coefficients that you multiply the electricity with. But they were having no luck with cloud, essentially. They spend a lot in the cloud. And but they were honestly, like, rather than going for just the double wins, which is kind of what most people want to do, where it's like, I'm going to use this as a mechanism to save more money, they honestly wanted to do no more harm and actually start making decisions purely for the sustainability benefits. And we kind of went in there with the FinOps team, worked on their FinOps reporting, combined it with their FinOps recommendations, and the Cloudability is their tool of choice. But then they started having more use cases around how do they use our carbon data, not our electricity data from the cloud, or because we have a big list of hourly carbon coefficients. They want to use that data to start choosing where they put their on-premise data centers as well. And really making the sustainability impact a huge factor in where they place their region, which I think is a very interesting one, because we had only really focused on how do we help people in their public cloud. But they wanted to align their on-premise reporting with their cloud reporting, and ultimately start even making decisions. Okay, I know I need to put a data center in this country. Do I go AWS, Azure, or on-premise to this one? And what is the sustainability impact of all three? And how do I weigh that against the cost as well? And it's kind of like the golden standard of making sustainability a big part of the trade-off decision. Because they would not go somewhere, even if it saved them 50% of their cost, if it doubled their carbon, but they're way beyond that point. So they're a super interesting one. And even in public sector as well, like the departments we're working with are relatively new to FinOps, and they didn't really have like a proper accountability structure for their cloud bill. But when you start adding carbon data to it, you're getting a lot more eyes onto your bills and your usage. And ultimately, we help them create that more of a FinOps function just with the carbon data, because people find carbon data typically more interesting than spend data. But if you put them on the same dashboard, it's all about how do you market efficient usage. And I think that's one of the main main use cases of GreenOps is to get more eyes on more usage. So, because the more ideas you've got piling in, the more use cases you find. And
okay, all right. So you spoke about carbon as one of the main things that people are caring about, right? And we're starting to develop more of an awareness that maybe some data centers might themselves be exposed to kind of climate risks themselves, because I know they were built on a floodplain, for example, and you don't want a data center on a floodplain in the middle of a flood, for example, right? But there's also like the flip side, that's too much water, but there are cases where people worry about not enough water, for example. I mean, is that something that you've seen people talk about more of? Because there does seem to be a growing awareness about the water footprint of digital infrastructure as well now. Is that something you're seeing people track or even try to like manage right now?
Well, we find that water metrics are very popular in the US, more so than the CO2 metrics. And I think it's because the people there feel the pain of lack of water. You got the Flint water crisis. In the UK, we've got an energy crisis stopping people from building homes. So what you really want to do is enable the person who's trying to use this data to drive efficiency, to tell as many different stories as possible. The more metrics and the more choice they have of what to present to the engineers and what to present to leadership, the better outcomes they're going to get. Water is a key one because data centers and electricity production uses tons of water. And the last thing you want to do is, go to a water scarce area and put a load of servers in there that are going to guzzle up loads of water. One, because if that water runs out, your whole data center is going to collapse. So you're exposing yourself to ESG risk. And also, it doesn't seem like the right thing to do. There are people trying to live there who need to use that water to live. But, you've got data centers sucking that water out. So, can you use this data to, again, drive different decisions, could invoke an emotional response that helps people drive different decisions or build more efficiently. And if you're saving cost at the end of that as well, then everyone's happy.
So maybe this is actually one thing we can talk about or just like drill into before we kind of move on to the next question and wrap up. So people have had incentives to track cost and cash for obvious reasons. Carbon, as you're seeing more and more laws actually have opinions about carbon footprint and being able to report that, people are getting a bit more aware of it. Like we've spoken about things like location-based figures and market-based figures. And we have previous episodes where we've explored and actually kind of helped people define those terms. But I feel comfortable using relatively technical terminology now because I think there is a growing sophistication, at least in certain pockets, for example. But water still seems to be a really new one, and it seems to be very difficult to actually find access to meaningful numbers. Even just the idea of like water in the first place, like when you hear figures about water being used, that might not be the same as water it might not be going away so it can't be used. It might be returned in a way that is maybe more difficult to use or isn't, sometimes it's clean and sometimes it's dirty, for example. But it seems to be poorly understood despite being quite an emotional topic. What's your experience been like when people try to engage with this, or when you try to even find some of the numbers to present to people and dashboards and things?
Surprisingly, all the cloud providers are able to produce factors. I think it's actually a requirement that when you have a data center, you know what the power usage effectiveness is, so what the overhead electricity is, and you know what the water usage effectiveness is. So, what is your cooling system? How much water does it use? How much does it withdraw? But then how much does it actually consume? So the difference between withdrawal and consumption is, withdrawal is you take clean water out, you're able to put clean water back relatively quickly. Consumption is you have either poisoned the water with some kind of, you've diluted it or
something,
with some kind of coolant that's not fit for human consumption, or you've now evaporated it. And there is some confusion sometimes around, well, it's evaporated, but it'll rain back down. But, a lake's evaporation and redeposition process is like a delicate balance. If it evaporates 10,000 liters a day and rains 10,000 liters a day after like a week of it going into the clouds and coming back down the mountain nearby, if you then have a data center next to it that will accelerate the evaporation by 30,000 liters a day, you really upset the delicate balance that's in there. And you talk about are these things sustainable? Like financial sustainability is, do you have enough money and income to last a long time, or will your burn rate run out next month? And it's the same with, sustainability. I think fresh water is a limiting resource in the same way a company's bank balance is their limiting resource. There's a limited amount of electricity. There's a limited amount of water out there. I think it was the CEO of NVIDIA. I saw a video of him on LinkedIn that said, right now, the limit to your cloud environment is how much money you can spend on it. But soon it will be how much electricity is there. You could spend $1 trillion, but if there's no more room for electricity, there's no more electricity to be produced, then you can't build any more data centers or server farms. And then water is the other side of that. I think water is even worse because we need water to even live. What happens when there's no more water because the data centers have it? I think it invokes a much more emotional response when you have good data that kind of is backed by good sources. You can tell an excellent story of why you need to start reducing.
Okay, well, hopefully we can see more of those numbers, because it seems like it's something that is quite difficult to get access to at the moment, water in particular. All right, so we're coming up to time now, and one thing we spoke about in the prep call was talking about the GHG protocol. We did a bit of nerding into this, and you spoke a little bit about, yes, accuracy is good, but you can't just only focus on accuracy if you want someone to actually use any of the tools or you want people to adopt stuff. And you said that in the GHG protocol, which is like the gold standard for people working out kind of the carbon footprint of things, you said that there were these different pillars inside of that matter. And if you just look at accuracy, that's not going to be enough. So can you maybe expand on that for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the GHG protocol as you? Because I think there is something that I think that there's something there that's worth exploring.
Yeah, so it just is a reminder for those out there. The pillars are accuracy, yes, completeness, consistency, transparency, and relevance. A lot of people worry a lot about the accuracy, but just to give an example, like if you had the most amazing accurate number for your entire cloud environment, 1,352 tons, 0.16 grams, but you are one engineer under one application running a few resources, the total carbon number is completely useless to you, to be honest. Like, how do you use that number to make a decision for your tiny, maybe 5 tons of information? So really, you've got to balance all of these things. The transparency is important because you need to build trust in the data. People need to understand where it comes from. The relevance is, again, are you filtering on just the resources that are important to me? And the consistency touches on, AWS is 1 ton versus Azure's 100 tons. You can't decide which cloud provider to go into based on these numbers because they're marking their own homework. They've got 100 different ways to calculate these things. And then the completeness is around, if you're only doing compute, but 90% is storage, you're missing out on loads of information. So, you could have a super accurate compute for Azure, but if you've got completely different numbers for AWS and you don't know where they come from, you've not got a good data set, a good GreenOps data set to be able to drive decisions or use as a catalyst. So you really need to prioritize all 5 of these pillars in equal measure and treat them all as a priority rather than just go for full accuracy.
Brilliant. We'll make a point of sharing a link to that in the show notes for anyone else who wants to dive into the world of pillars of sustainability reporting, I suppose. All right. Okay. Well, James, I think that takes us to time. So just before we wrap up, there's going to be the usual things like where people can find you, but are there any particular projects that are catching your eye right now that you're kind of excited about or you'd like to direct people's attention to? Because we'll share a link to the company you work for, obviously, and possibly yourself on LinkedIn or whatever it is. But is there anything else that you've seen in the last couple of weeks that you find particularly exciting in the world of GreenOps or kind of the wider sustainable software field?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of work being done around AI sustainability is particularly interesting. I recommend people go and look at some of the Hugging Face information around which models are more more electrically efficient. And from a Greenpixie side, we've got a newsletter now for people wanting to learn more about GreenOps. And in fact, we're building out a GreenOps training and certification that I'd be very interested to get a lot of people's feedback on.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you one more time. If people want to find you on LinkedIn, they would just look up James Hall Greenpixie, presumably, right? Or something like that.
Please. Yeah. And engage with our website as well.
Well, James, thank you so much for taking me along to this deep dive into the world of GreenOps, cloud carbon reporting, and all the and the rest. Hope you have a lovely day, and take care of yourself, mate. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.